Hey, what is going on, guys? So today we're going to talk about something very controversial, arguably one of the most controversial things that the vegan movement partakes in. We're going to discuss whether or not there is any merit to vegan and animal rights activists drawing comparisons between what animals go through today for human benefit to accounts of human slavery in history, and maybe even things like the World War II Holocaust. And before anybody comes at me saying that I have no right to speak on this topic because I'm not African American, I am not one of those people that think that a person's identity is partially what validates their arguments. An argument and its validity obviously should stand on its own legs, not the legs of the person making the argument. But if you're one of those people who, regardless, are going to make this kind of objection to this video, understand that African Americans are not the only marginalized groups in human history that has been a victim of slavery. For example, the Jewish people were enslaved as well, and I myself am Jewish. So if you operate under this kind of thinking where a person cannot draw comparisons between a marginalized group and animals, or even speak on such comparisons as I am in this video, unless they are a part of the specific marginalized group in question, I am a part of a specific marginalized group in the past, and therefore you should listen to what I have to say. But yeah, I really hate this kind of thinking. So as a Jewish activist or Jewish animal rights activist, I give all non-Jewish animal rights activists the right to go ahead and discuss topics related to vegan activists or animal rights activists comparing Holocaust victims in World War II to factory farming victims such as animals. Oh, and not just factory farming, any account of animal agriculture. This tangent aside, to be clear, I mainly want to discuss if there is any merit or validity to vegan activists making comparisons between animals used by humans today and human slaves being used by other humans in the past. I don't aim to uncover whether or not this style of activism is effective, just whether or not there is actually any merit or validity to deploying it. If there is time at the end of this video, I will go into whether or not I think it is a good idea for vegan activists to compare victims of human slavery or, the World War II Holocaust to victims of animal agriculture and factory farming in general. Alrighty, let's begin. Firstly, something needs to be made very clear. There is a fundamental difference between comparing two things and equating two things. Very often online, I see people conflating these two terms when an activist is simply trying to just show similarities between two or more different things. If we look at the definition of the word compare, we'll see estimate, measure, or note the similarity or dissimilarity between. And if we look at the definition of the word equate, we will see consider one thing to be the same as or equivalent to another. So if it isn't obvious, these are two very different definitions. And if you've spent any amount of time online reading or listening to debates between vegans and non-vegans, you will see many meat eaters emotionally exploding at a vegan drawing a comparison between non-human animals and, say, past human slaves, victims of the World War II Holocaust, etc. They very often react as if vegans in these situations are aiming to equate the value or moral value of humans and animals. They'll say something like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you're comparing animals to black people," as if vegans are equating animals to black people. But more often than not, a comparison is being made, not an equation. I've even seen this conflation of the word compare and equate in areas outside of animal rights online. The political streamer Destiny, in a debate about pedophilia, was trying to make the point that pedophiles have an innate sexual desire, like an attraction they cannot choose, just like gay people do, straight people do, etc. And the people listening thought he was equating pedophiles to gay people, when instead he was just saying they're similar and that both have an innate sexual attraction to something.
Well, so right now it seems like from everything that I've seen, you can't move people out of these very innate sexual feelings. We tried it for a long time with gay conversion therapy. People have tried it with trans conversion therapy.
Gays to we're not talking about pedophiles.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying.
Why do you keep doing that?
It's not the same thing.
Wait, why do I keep doing what?
I'm confused about why do you keep putting you're bringing up gay conversion therapy.
It's not the same thing. Yes, but it still doesn't explain how you can compare someone who's a pedophile to someone who's gay or trans. I don't see how the two are comparable.
So yeah, guys, when you think about it, according to the definition of the word compare, you can basically compare any two things. You can compare a human to a dog and how both are similar in that both are animals. You can compare them and how both are dissimilar in that one is human and the other is a dog. You can even compare a human to a rock in that both are comprised of atoms, both are on planet Earth. You get the point. So whether or not there is validity to comparing two things overall, there basically is in every case. Big shocker, I know. So if a vegan decides to compare animals to human slaves, there is a seemingly infinite amount of comparisons we can make, but here is a couple that are 100% reasonable and common. Human slaves and animals are similar in that both are considered property. Both have their basic rights stripped away. Both are used to generate profit. Both are considered commodities. Both are subjugated. Both are held in or forced into servitude or enslaved. So in short, to the meat eaters watching who are so triggered when vegans make these kinds of comparisons, when vegans are making these kinds of comparisons, their intention isn't always to necessarily equate humans and animals. One can acknowledge that past human slaves and animals today are the same and that both are enslaved without equating the immorality of both cases of enslavement. Now, of course, there are vegans who would equate the immorality of enslaved animals and enslaved humans, but I am just making a very specific point right now, and that point is that it is actually very reasonable to compare an animal to a human, showing that both are enslaved. I'm gonna use my Jew card real quick for another example. Comparing victims in the World War II Holocaust to pigs, and that both were gassed to death, is also reasonable. No equating of the two beings, the Holocaust victim and the pig that are thrown in gas chambers, is needed to conclude that the comparison is indeed reasonable. The main problem with drawing these kinds of comparisons is going to be based on what I mentioned earlier, and that many people take comparisons to be the same thing as equations. Kind of funny when you think about it. They're basically equating the definition of the word equate to the definition of the word compare. This is either coming from a person who's having a complete emotional reaction, somebody who has a misunderstanding of what the word comparison means, or both. If somebody denies that it is reasonable to compare a pig to a Holocaust victim, and that both are victims of gas chambers, after being shown evidence of both beings being gas chambered, and after being explained the difference between comparing and equating two things, this person just isn't accepting reality or needs to provide evidence that one of the two were not actually gas chambered. So, is it reasonable or valid for vegans to draw comparisons between non-human animals and human slaves in that both are subjugated, exploited, enslaved, viewed as property, commodities, and have their basic rights stripped away? Absolutely. Is it reasonable for vegans to draw comparisons between Holocaust victims and pigs in that both are gas chambered? Yes. And here's the irony of all this, and I'm gonna have to read this part of my script because I can't simply memorize it. It's a bit too complex for my really dumb B12 deficient brain. The irony of all this is that for a non-vegan to react in disagreement to a vegan drawing a comparison between animals and black people, saying something like, "Oh my God, I can't believe you are comparing animals to black people," they are, without realizing it, giving themselves the burden of having to compare animals to black people to show that they are so dissimilar that the comparison, which they're interpreting as an equation, is unreasonable. In other words, they are committing themselves to having to compare black people to animals while in the process of objecting to comparing black people to animals. I hope that wasn't too confusing. So there is some time left, so I do want to cover whether or not it is a good idea for vegans to draw these comparisons from a perspective of activism efficacy. So clearly we have established that making such comparisons is reasonable and valid. But the fact that something you say actually makes sense does not tell us whether or not it is a good idea to say it in an effort to convince somebody of a specific proposition or moral position. Because of the existence of this common error people have in hearing animal to human slave comparisons, in that they figure you're equating the two, I find it necessary to explain the distinction between comparing and equating two things, which is partially why I decided to make this video. It is very clear that when you are trying to communicate a specific message to a specific audience, the communicator, who is going to be you in this situation, should be aware of the way in which your audience's mind works. Having access to this kind of information isn't always easy, and of course, when meeting a new person, you will basically have zero access to this information. Situations like this is why I find it so important for you to be prepared to season your animal rights activism with explanations and disclaimers, especially if you plan on making comparisons like the ones discussed in this video. Sounds pretty obvious, but it's just very important for people to understand what you truly mean. Essentially, there is a lot of emotional and mental tripwire in people's minds, which cause them to respond to such comparisons in a completely triggered and unreasonable way. I would say this is one of the big things that differentiates me from Gary Yourofsky. Gary very often says things like they are, and he's been given shit for it in the past from kinds of people with this emotional tripwire in their brains. Although the comparisons Gary is making are valid, the audience isn't always capable of understanding this due to the reasons gone over in this video. So if you're going to make these kinds of comparisons and somebody is triggered, just send them this video or explain to the person what I explained in this video. Hopefully they will be open to understanding why these comparisons are completely valid. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you support my work and want to support me on Patreon and make my work more possible and give me more time to work on this stuff, you can click the link in the pinned comment, and I'll see you in the next video.
Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid wannabe sense of irony here. Who's your audience? Nobody gets these dumb jokes. Dude, even vegans don't get your weird, stupid